Thank you so much for being with us today. This is Rob Wall, and I'm hosting another of our conversations looking at leadership and communication in times of crisis. And I have the distinct privilege today, I'm very excited, about someone that's mentored me and many others from a distance, from many of his books over the last few years. I have the fantastic author, speaker, researcher, presenter, Carmine Gallo, joining me today. Carmine, how are you?
Hi, Rob. Thank you so much. That's a very kind introduction.
How are you coping with lockdown?
Doing well. I have two daughters who are going to virtual school, so homeschooling.
Yeah.
That's been working out very well. And we are cautiously optimistic, as they say, cautiously optimistic and hoping for the best.
Fantastic. Well, let's jump right in. I mean, there are going to be people watching this from all over the globe, but one thing we all have in common is that we're at a time and a place where we need to rediscover ourselves. Some of us need to reinvent ourselves, and communication and the way we tell our stories is going to be a key facet of that. And so this is your area of expertise. For those of you in watching this that don't know Carmine, could you just share a little bit about who you are and the genesis really behind you becoming an expert in communication?
I'm passionate about communication skills in all of its facets, whether it's storytelling or pitching yourself, your ideas, your company, startups. I've written 10 books on the subject of leadership and communication in different categories, different styles. I've written a book on the TED Talks and what we can learn from some of the most influential and best public speakers of our time. And I've also written single subject books like The Presentation Secrets of Steve Jobs and what people can learn from how Steve Jobs articulated the benefits behind his products or his services. I see everything through the lens of communication, story, inspiration. How do leaders inspire people to be their best selves?
Fantastic. And obviously a lot of people are now going online and trying to create businesses and trying to pitch themselves in a very saturated, noisy world. Storytelling clearly is going to give people the edge. So where do we start, Carmen? Where do we go? Why should we start with storytelling?
Think about it this way, Rob. While the tools of human communication have changed, Abraham Lincoln did not have a TED stage. He had a tree stump instead. But he used storytelling and stories, actually biblical stories quite often, to engage his listeners and to bring people into his journey. The tools of communication have changed. We didn't have Zoom meetings 5 years ago. We didn't have PowerPoint 30 years ago. So while the tools of communication have changed, the human brain has not. And that's why I spend a great deal of my research on neuroscience and speaking to scientists and anthropologists and molecular biologists and people who understand how we process information. And what's remarkable is that the tools of communication have changed, but the mind has not. So we still process information in very much the same way. Why is it that we enjoy listening to parables? Why is it that we enjoy listening to Sunday sermons? Why do we speak in metaphor and stories? It's because our mind is wired for story. So as long as you can understand how people process their world, how people process information and want to receive their information, it will help you be a more impactful communicator.
Well, let's camp out on that for a moment, Carmen, because something very specific happens in the brain, doesn't it, when someone tells a story? If there are 500 people in a room, there's a very specific mirroring that takes place, and you'll be able to explain the language much better than I. But what goes on when someone's telling a story to another person?
This is one of the most fascinating areas of my research in the last few years. I've talked to anthropologists who say that when our ancestors gained control of fire, it was a major milestone in our species development, because now with fire, we could cook food, we could ward off predators, and people sat around campfires telling stories to one another. And it was the stories that informed, that educated, and that inspired people to become explorers and to venture out of the cave and into their worlds. Remarkably, it was the storytellers in a tribe who were the most admired people. And I think, Rob, we haven't really changed that much. It is great communicators who we admire, even in this crisis, isn't it? It's people who we look to for calm and composure and perspective. Here in the States, for example, Andrew Cuomo, the New York governor, has been earning very high marks for his ability to show empathy, to deliver facts and information, to tell the stories of the first responders, all in a way that lends itself to a feeling of solace and calm and even inspiration, that not only are we going to get through it, but we're going to learn something to be better. That he's like the ancient storytellers. We still hang around campfires. That's how we enjoy. We can't do it now, but this is sort of a virtual campfire. And look at all of the ways people are connecting now with bringing up different faces in Zoom or Google Hangouts or in their virtual mediums. That's sitting around a campfire. So the tools of communication have changed, but the human mind is not. And I think that's one of the most critical things to understand, and to understand how the role of story is something that is absolutely fundamental, not only as a rhetorical device to get your message across, it's the way we are wired to process our world. So if you don't understand story, or you do not speak in story, or at least understand what it means to your listeners, I think you're missing a considerable way of making an impact on people.
That's really helpful. And I can speak as a pastor and a communicator in the sphere of Christianity. And one thing that we have learned from you, I mean, I know you've written more, but I've got a few of your books here. And I think the main one in my sphere of influence has really been the two books on storytellers' secrets. And you outline and paint so many practical principles on how we can become better communicators. But if someone was sitting like I am now across the room from you, having a coffee, wanting to be coached in communication, maybe pick out 2 or 3 key areas where you would recommend we start.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad you brought up those the 2 of those books, Talk Like Ted and The Storyteller's Secret. Yes, thank you. Just as a quick background, Talk Like Ted is a very popular public speaking book around the world, and that makes me I'm blessed and gratified by hearing that. There was a chapter in Talk Like Ted about how TED speakers are coached to use stories to inform and to educate and to inspire, and how most great TED Talks are made up mostly of stories. Some facts, but stories to reinforce those facts. And I found that such an interesting area of research that I took that one chapter and built out a whole book called The Storyteller's Secret. And that's where I would go into the research on the science of storytelling. Fascinating to me is I used a number of Christian examples as well in The Storyteller's Secret, because what's fascinating to me, and I think this is relevant obviously for our audience, is that faith and public speaking are intertwined, aren't they, Rob? If you think about even the words that we use, great speakers are said to inspire their audiences, inspire, to be infused with the Spirit. A great speaker who promotes their cause or their idea, or in the business world, a company, is called an evangelist. Yes. We admire people with a passion for their topic or who are called to a career. We use biblical terms to identify those strategies and techniques and habits of great speakers. Pope Francis, who is someone who I enjoy reading his homilies and the sermons. He gave a beautiful Easter sermon, called it the contagion of hope. Wow. Pope Francis is a skilled communicator. And in an article that I read years ago, he referred to his Jesuit training as helping him become a great communicator. So he does several things that I think are very impactful for not only pastors or Christian leaders, but leaders in any area. He does a couple of things that all great speakers do. One is he speaks in metaphor. Metaphorical thinking obviously goes back to the parables in the Bible. It goes back to Aristotle, who said being a master of metaphor is the most powerful force by far. So metaphors, taking something that is abstract and comparing it to what is tangible, is one of the most powerful rhetorical techniques we have. For example, during the coronavirus pandemic, a lot of people they're influenced by speakers like Andrew Cuomo. Let me just go back to him because he uses a lot of metaphorical thinking. And he uses some wartime metaphors, which in this case probably work very well because we are all in a battle against a common enemy. And by saying those type of things, it inspires people to volunteer, to step up. Instead of making munitions like we did in World War II, factories are now being converted to modern day munitions. He says, Cuomo said, the battle is at the top of the mountaintop. And the troops in that battle, the frontline troops, are our first responders. And here is how we have to equip them for that battle. So in a crisis, leaders step up using metaphorical thinking. So metaphors are very powerful. And once again, it's because of the way we process our world. That is, we think in metaphor. How do I take something new and compare it to something familiar or concrete? Yeah. Pope Francis, the contagion of hope. In every sermon, Pope Francis talks about metaphor. He uses metaphors. He also does something very interesting. He uses what's called the rule of three.
Yes.
Rule of three. And Pope Francis has said that he learned in, what is it called? Homiletics. Homiletics is when you learn how to preach and how to give homily. He learned to break things up into three. Well, three is a very powerful number in the area of persuasion and rhetoric. The human mind, we only have, in short-term memory, we only have a capacity for only about 3 or 4 ideas before you forget everything you were told. And that's why people like Thomas Jefferson wrote that we have 3 unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He did not write 18 unalienable rights. John Adams chose Thomas Jefferson to write the Declaration of Independence because he was a more skilled writer, and he wrote for the ear. And we tend to group things in threes. When you're giving a virtual meeting, when you're giving a sermon, when you're preaching a sermon, when you are being interviewed for a job, think about 3. What are the 3 reasons someone should hire you? What are the 3 points from a particular story that people should remember? Yeah. 3 is a very powerful, not only number in the area of persuasion and rhetoric, it's one of the most impactful rhetorical tools that you can use.
That's so helpful. Another Christian leader is Joel Osteen, and you focused a lot in one of your books on Joel's brilliant storytelling gift and the rhetorical devices he uses. Now, I'm going to use one of your techniques now in this interview and just create a little bit of tension, because there are going to be people watching this that are communicating every single Sunday, sometimes 2 or 3 times a week, to the same congregation. And so they are faced with, you could say, the dilemma of having to inspire, having to provoke action every single week. Should communicators be using the same structure every week, or should we spend the first 5 minutes selling our credentials and why you should listen to me? Or should occasionally we give them a moment of reveal at the end of the sermon and build our way to that aha moment? How can we be diverse and mix it up a bit so our congregation doesn't always think, oh, here we go again?
Oh, I love it. I love it. Well, what a great question. I'm glad you brought up Joel Osteen.
Yeah.
I have met Joel twice, and he is in person. We've talked a great deal about communication, storytelling. Joel is a storyteller. And what he does very, very well, and I think one of the main reasons why people feel uplifted after a Lakewood service is because he applies a story from the Bible that is often maybe abstract or unfamiliar with our world, and he applies it to your everyday life. And he injects his own personal stories in there. He injects stories of other people. So there's so many different ways that he's using the power of story. There are different types of stories that you can be telling. Every week, well, first of all, everything should be based in story form. That doesn't mean telling a story all the time. Story form simply means that there's got to be some kind of structure to it. So, for example, every great story has a 3-part structure. There's a setup, there's some tension or a villain, and then there's a conclusion, a resolution at the end.
Very helpful, yeah.
So storytelling sometimes involves just having a structure, but break it up. Tell personal stories. I listen to a lot of sermons from different denominations. And what I find is that there's not a lot of personal stories in there. So you don't really know a lot about the person or the pastor delivering the sermon. Now, maybe their congregation knows more about that. And so I'll have to, add that caveat. But there's not a lot of personal stories. So just because you tell me a story from the Bible, how does that relate to me? The best way of making anything relatable is to connect it to something in your own personal life. That's when people kind of come alive and connect with you. Personal stories, and Rob, I don't want to get too far into this. There's a whole science and research along personal stories. There's a guy out of Princeton University in a lab who is studying how personal stories create a mental connection between two people. Some of the greatest speakers who I've talked to use personal stories of struggle and redemption. Those are powerful. Great speakers use stories of struggle, hurdles, victory over darkness, light over darkness, struggle, and redemption as ways of connecting with people on a much deeper, more meaningful level. Are you telling enough personal stories? Are you looking for those stories that are happening all around you? One of the reasons why I'm writing a lot in this pandemic is because I find stories everywhere. Every day when I pick up the newspaper or go on social media, I'm finding stories of heroism or stories that relate to my particular topic, which is leadership and communication. There's so many different stories that I can tell, that I can bring into my own public speaking or into my writing. But stories are all around you. You need to be aware and start looking for those stories and have those notepads, which I have right in front of me now, because if you tell me something that's interesting, I jot it down. But again, you got to have those pads and those notepads and constantly be looking for stories and thinking, creatively about the stories that you're sharing. But break it up too, Rob. Do something unexpected. That's one of the areas of persuasion and public speaking that is fascinating to me. People want something familiar, which is why someone like Joel Osteen can always start with, hey, I always start with a joke. Here's a joke. They kind of want something familiar.
Yeah.
So you can't completely, knock them off their socks and give them something that is completely different and unfamiliar. People actually want something familiar, but they also want to be surprised. How do you do that? You know, every once in a while you can bring in some multimedia or call out somebody from the audience or whoever it might be. These are very simple ways of surprising people and giving some people something unexpected. But this is where the art of communication comes in. There's a science and there's an art. And the art is hard. It takes creativity. But boy, when you can do it well and you can lift people's spirits through the power of your words, that's magical.
Do you think good communication is an instinct that some have and others don't, or is something that you can actually invest in? For example, if every communicator had 2 hours available every morning to work on their craft, what areas should they target and focus on?
I'm glad you brought up that question. Public speaking and communication is a skill that anyone can build and improve upon. It's like any skill. It can be worked on, it can be improved, it can be sharpened. We just mentioned a famous pastor, Joel Osteen. Well, one of the reasons why I began speaking to Mr. Osteen is because I heard, and I got this confirmed through him, is that he was terrified of public speaking.
Yes.
He was because he did not see himself, and this is such a powerful lesson, especially in faith, he did not see himself as someone who can lead people. Isn't that amazing? And yet the people around him did, but he didn't believe it himself. And so that anxiety gave him pause. He was not in front of people for 17 years. He let his dad do it because he didn't see himself as the speaker and the leader. It was only after a year, after his dad died, after an entire year of being very, very nervous about public speaking, that he came into his element. So to me, those are the interesting stories. People who don't believe in themselves at first, but others see something in them. So everyone, that's the beauty of public speaking and inspiration, is through the words you use, you can convince people to do things that they otherwise thought was impossible. And that's why pastors play a critical role. That's why great leaders and good speakers play a critical role in our society. But it's a skill that you can and should build. Be humble. Don't be arrogant. Don't get complacent, because it is a skill that you can constantly improve upon and get better. A lot of people forget, many people just don't know that Martin Luther King was a pastor, and he practiced sermons when he was in college. You may have heard that story. I just came across that story a few years ago. I didn't know that. He would practice great sermons and speeches and sermons that he had heard closed door in a dorm room when he was attending university. That's extraordinary to me. So here is a man who, by the time he gave the great "I Have a Dream" speech, had already given thousands of sermons ahead of time. And that's why he was able to cut and paste different parts of different sermons on the fly, impromptu, on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. You don't get to be that skilled unless you do it a lot and really think through, how am I going to communicate? How do I become a better speaker? Sometimes it's a matter of watching other great speakers and trying to understand what is it that they do, or what is it that that person did in this particular event or environment that connected with people.
So would you say production of your own content and craft is more important than the consumption of listening to other fantastic speakers, or is it a balance?
Well, no, I think it's a balance. I think you learn from watching and analyzing and thinking about great speakers. What is it that they do that connects with people and lifts their spirits and inspires them to do the impossible? I guarantee that there are structures, and I hesitate to use the word formula, but there is some kind of formula that they're using that connects with people in a deep and meaningful way. And that's why I enjoy reading books on great speakers. Not because the book itself is about them as speakers, but you can learn a lot on how they became great communicators. One of my favorite books is called Leadership in Turbulent Times, and it's by the historian Doris Kearns Goodwin. And she talks about various presidents, Franklin Roosevelt and Abraham Lincoln. And they asked Doris Kearns Goodwin, who's a Pulitzer Prize winning historian, what did you learn in your research that surprised you? And she said that Abraham Lincoln was such a good storyteller. And one of the main books that Lincoln used to learn how to communicate with brevity, conciseness, and story is the Bible.
Yeah.
So again, it sort of gets back to what I was saying earlier. I think faith and biblical stories and great public speaking are more intertwined than people think.
So stories is great for content, and it's great for bringing structure and bringing your message alive. My next question, it's almost a geeky technical thing, but one thing, and I've been asked to share this, to ask this from a variety of speakers, one thing we're not often taught in theology colleges and schools is simple things like what to do with our hands when we're communicating, and those little technical things that differentiate a good communicator from a really great one. So my question's twofold. Where can people go to discover these intricate aspects that form a great speaker, and who are the great speakers? Of course, Steve Jobs, you talk about his presentation when he released the iPhone as being the greatest presentation ever. He's obviously one great speaker you'd recommend, but who else would you recommend as great communicators to listen to?
Well, I think if you go on to TED.com, there are some fabulous speakers who are very skilled with body language and verbal delivery. And it's interesting that you bring that up. I think you're absolutely right, Rob. And it's not just in the area of sermons and theology, certainly in business as well. Yeah. Most people who I talk to who have an MBA are never taught about storytelling and public speaking and communication skills the way we're talking about them. And they're certainly not talk about verbal delivery and body language. Yes, two very important facets of communication and being impactful. The way I look at body language is to understand that when you are passionate about a topic, it comes through. It comes through in your voice and your vocal delivery and in the way you use your hands. Now, I'm Italian, so it's a little easier for me to use hand gestures, a little more natural. But people process the message through not only the words, but the way you deliver it, the inflections in your voice, your pacing, the way you pause for impact, when you speed up, when you slow down, the volume, the body language, your facial expressions, the smile on your face. So all of these things do connect with people and they process it. They just don't say it. It's unconscious. They don't quite know why they like a particular speaker. So yeah, it is an area that I don't write about very often, Rob, and I guess I should try to do it more often. I just think it's very hard to write about and to get it across on text. You have to see it, which is why I do refer people to TED Talks. There's one gentleman in particular I'd like to suggest, and he's a devout Christian man as well. And his name is Brian Stevenson.
Ah, yes.
Yeah, so Brian Stevenson is a human rights attorney in the States, and he is the subject of a movie that came out in January with Jamie Foxx. And yeah, there were some other very famous actors in the movie, but it's called Just Mercy. Mm-hmm. And Just Mercy is about this human rights attorney named Brian Stevenson, who gave a very famous TED Talk on the injustices in the criminal justice system here in America. He lives in Alabama. What's fascinating about Brian Stevenson is I've had a couple of conversations with him. Wow. And Rob, he's not only is he devout Christian, who infuses a lot of Christianity in his public speaking, But Brian Stevenson is also a student of communication. And so he studies storytelling and narrative. And what's amazing about his particular TED Talk is he goes 20 minutes with just him, no PowerPoint, no visuals, and yet he draws you in. Watch his body language, the way he uses his hands and his gestures to reinforce his message, but also listen carefully to the way he delivers it, the way he speeds up and talks fast when he needs to, when he's trying to make an urgent point, and then when he slows down and he lowers his voice to be more dramatic. You can tell it's a man who has really studied the craft. And I know as a fact that he has studied the craft intently. Brian Stevenson delivers this TED Talk and unexpectedly elicits this outpouring of emotion from the audience, who spontaneously donate $1 million to his nonprofit. And he didn't ask for it in the TED Talk. He doesn't ask for money, but they did it anyway. So again, it's another example of someone who has deep faith, a deep biblical background. He knows his Bible very, very well, and infuses faith and inspiration in the way he motivates and talks, and was the subject of a big Hollywood movie. Amazing story, very good person to watch, to learn about everything from storytelling, great storyteller, to nonverbal body language, and also the vocal delivery.
Fantastic. Brian Stevenson, fantastic guy. Final couple of questions, Carmen. What's the kind of common mistakes or weaknesses you see in communicators across the board, from business pitches to visionary messages to sermons? What are the common things you think, gosh, I've seen this all over the place?
Rob, people don't practice or rehearse nearly as much as they should.
Oh, that's a thing for a few people, myself included.
Yeah, it's I have spoken to and interviewed sports coaches and sports psychologists. And you know how they train a golfer to make that 3-foot putt to win the tournament, or a soccer player to get the field goal. Now I'm mixing metaphors and analogies, because I'm thinking about soccer for you and football for me, right? American football. But the penalty kicks, right? So how do you train a great athlete? Is they go through the repetitions, thousands and thousands of times. But there's something different though. They don't just repeat the skill. They repeat it under pressure.
Yes.
So that's why they play games with each other. Or they'll bet, they bet, or they play these games with each other, or even mental games, that now this 3-foot putt counts. And if you miss it, you lose the entire tournament, which means you got to go back and you have to make 50 in a row. That they play these mental games with each other to put some stress onto the athlete. We don't do that in public speaking very often, do we?
Yeah.
Most of the CEOs who I work with mostly CEOs and teams, and they will go through their PowerPoint slides, 5 minutes ahead of time, and they'll just kind of glance through it. They weren't even involved in crafting that particular presentation. And then they get up there and they meander, and they're convoluted and they're confusing. And that's why they haven't rehearsed as if they were doing so in real world conditions. Some of the great TED speakers who I interviewed for that one book you brought up, Talk Like TED, they rehearsed their TED Talk 200 times.
200 times. Yeah.
200 times. And the more you rehearse, it does not mean that you come across robotic. A lot of people will tell me, well, then you look over rehearsed. No, that means you can enjoy it more, because you know exactly where you're going. You can actually have more flexibility in it as well, and bring in other parts. That's the only way someone like Martin Luther King was able to improvise "I Have a Dream." And some people don't know that. We've learned that in the last few years. He improvised the most famous part of I Have a Dream. He pulled that from another sermon on the spot. You only can do that once you've rehearsed enough. Obviously, Martin Luther King, by definition, had rehearsed thousands of times. But most people don't practice or rehearse. Steve Jobs, one of the great corporate presenters of our time, rehearsed and practiced for every major presentation weeks ahead of time. So I'm not suggesting that you rehearse every sermon, 200 times, but they're 20 minutes. Can you at least do it? Can you do it 5 to 10 times ahead of the week? And every time you do it, you're going to find ways of making it briefer, more concise. It's the same with anything in business, Rob. If you're interviewing, and I've heard this from a lot of people who have won interviews, who have won jobs that maybe they weren't as qualified for on paper, and yet they came across as outstanding communicators because they rehearsed. They had somebody, a friend or a peer, pepper them with hard questions or questions that they were likely to get in an interview situation. And they would record themselves with a smartphone. Watch yourself. How are you answering those questions? And so by the time you do the interview for real, you've already been there. You've been there 10 times. That's the power of rehearsing and practice.
That's really challenging, I think, for most of us. Because I think you can get to a stage where you're good enough and competent enough, and you could just take 10 minutes beforehand and jot down the structure and your big kind of big statement and idea, and then deliver it. But actually, what you're saying is, if you really want to be the next level, you actually have to commit some discipline to practicing.
Joel Osteen begins practicing on Wednesday. He writes Tuesday, Wednesday. He begins practicing by Wednesday, and he's already practiced his talk that we see on weekends many, many times. I forgot how many. I think he told me, but sometimes it could be 6, 12 times, 6 to 12. So he's already practiced the entire sermon, and then he does it twice on Saturday, and then it's recorded on Sunday. So you don't see it.
No.
What we see on television has already been done 12 times.
Yeah, and there's sorry, go on.
No, that's okay. I think that's why it appears as smooth and confident. First time, second time, third time, not as much.
And I think there's a life management skill or lesson somewhere in here to live by priorities, not by pressures, because he must absolutely focus his attention on that Sunday message, mustn't he?
Yeah.
That I'm going to deliver.
Yep. And so notice something, Rob. And again, I'm using Joel Osteen because we could see him.
Yeah.
It's an example. But what you'll notice is the body language and the verbal delivery. So he's already practiced it a lot. But what he can do is make eye contact. He can make eye contact with individuals in the room. It's a stadium, but they feel as though he's making eye contact with them because he's looking at a certain section of the room. And what he does is he still has his notes, but he only glances at his notes in passing and then looks up to deliver. Please, above all, don't read. You're breaking eye contact when you're reading. At least have it internalized to a point where you can look down and then look up and deliver your message.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Carmen. In a moment, you can let us know how to find you and find out more about you and what you're working on at the moment. But final question. I was trying to wrestle with what the final question would be, but I think I'm going to stick with this one. What do you know that we don't know, that we need to know, that's not in any of your books?
Well, I'm going to say something, but I realize that you all probably already know this, that the trajectory of the world is always up. There's always that light in the darkness. And now I feel like I really am preaching to the choir, because this is what you know. Absolutely. And, I've taken a lot of solace in the last 20 years through the books I read through history. And because that there's been dark times, and we know that there's been worse times as well. When we compare this pandemic to the pandemic of 1918, it's a very different world today. In fact, there are ways we could say in many ways we should be grateful and optimistic that we are experiencing a plague, which has been with us through the beginning of time, at this time in human history. So this is, it sounds weird to say, but this is the greatest time in human history, if you just look at it historically. And that's why people like Bill Gates and others can talk in a way that's optimistic. They actually use the word optimism, which sounds a little strange in the middle of a pandemic, but the reason why they're optimistic is because they see how much progress we've made. And the only way to do that, Rob, is through history. And that's why I'm such a big history buff. I love Winston Churchill in World War II. He was able to give people the feeling of being fearless because he himself understood the scope of history and the progress that the world makes. So it's really powerful. Those people who can see the light at the end of the darkness, those are the people we need to hear from more than ever.
Thank you so much. And as we come into land, one thing that's really helped me over the years is you have a fantastic blog that the archive goes all the way back to 2005, I think. Or like so far back, it's amazing the content you have. But people are going to be thinking after watching this, how can I find out more? How can I get more content from Carmine? Obviously your books, but where can we find you?
If you can remember a good Italian name like Carmine Gallo.
Very good.
Yeah, you can find me. My website is carminegallo.com. And if you just go to carminegallo.com, you will be able to connect with me. You'll sign up for my newsletter, and that's a good way for me to keep in touch with you. And you can find me on most of the social media platforms under Carmine Gallo, like on Twitter, Carmine Gallo. But carminegallo.com is your first place. Place one that'll talk about all my books, my blog, and all of the ways you can connect with me. And I connect with everybody who approaches me through LinkedIn or my blog or through my website. So I'd certainly like to have a conversation with anybody who's watching.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Carmine. Well, I hope you stay safe and sane during this time in lockdown. And thank you for your time. And it's been a real gift to us. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
All the best now.